Rise, veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience à la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Yes, good morning all. Could we call the case, please?
Good morning, Madam President. Good morning, Your Honours. This is the situation in Darfur, Sudan, in the case of the prosecutor versus Ali Muhammad Ali Abd Al Rahman. Case reference ICC 0205-0120. And for the record, we are in open session.
Yes, thank you very much. Could we have the appearances first for the victims' representatives this morning?
Thank you, Madam President. Your Honours, the victims today are represented by my Associate Counsel Anand Shah, sitting to my far right, by our new case manager, who I would like to introduce, Saif Kassis, and I take the opportunity to thank our former case manager, Idris Anbari, here publicly for the work and the efforts he has put in the preparation of this victim's case. Thank you, Idris. We have behind me our field assistant, Umda. He's a vital person on the team, and we are very happy and grateful to have him here with us today. And behind us, also very important, our two interns, Noor Mohammed and Saskia Ajova Afande, and myself, Nathalie von Distinghausen. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sorry, I was trying to get my earphones fixed in. Yes, thank you very much. Yes, appearances for the defence.
Bonjour, Madame la Présidente.
Good morning, Your Honour, Your Honours. Good morning, dear colleagues. For Mr. Ali Mohammed Al Rahman present in the courtroom today, Madame Noor Wadani, Madame Marguerite Remy, who is an intern in the team, Madame Eva Kalb, the assistant responsible for evidence analysis, Madame Audrey Matteo, our legal advisor, my colleague Ian Edwards is present at the hearing through the screen at a distance, and myself, Cyril Lauchi, counsel.
Yes, just before you sit down, Mr. Lauchi, I understand that you have a meeting organised at 4 o'clock this afternoon with the registrar. I was proposing to sit because Mr. Edwards presumably will be here.
Je pense que c'est la meilleure.
I think that's the best solution, and if you would allow me, I will discreetly come into the courtroom on my return, and I take the advantage to stand. I saw that I forgot in the team our case manager, last but not least, Ahmad Issa.
Yes, I don't know how you could have done that, Mr. Lauchi. Yes, appearances for prosecution, please.
Good morning, Madam President. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, everyone. Julian Nichols with Claire Sabatini, Allison Whitford, and Edward Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nichols. Yes, Ms. von Listinghausen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. So, it's the victim's turn today. We've endeavored to introduce into our opening statement as many words as possible that come from them and not from us. But we are very honored and humbled, actually, to take this role today. While I'm standing here today as the common legal representative of the 600 individuals, primarily from the Fur community, who have been granted the status of participating victims in the case against Mr. Abd Al Rahman, history sadly seems to be repeating itself. It is, to say the least, distressing that almost 2 decades after the events that are the subject of these proceedings, potential international crimes are occurring in Darfur right now. Conservative estimates are that hundreds of people have lost their lives in Darfur and across Sudan since the outbreak of the new conflict on the 15th of April of this year. According to the latest updates on UNHCR's data portal as of 1st June, almost 1.2 million persons have been displaced within Sudan as a result of the current conflict. Nearly 400,000 additional persons have fled into neighboring countries, notably Chad, Sudan, the Central African Republic, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Among those seeking safety abroad are refugees of other nationalities who were hosted by Sudan, some of whom have now had to return to the very countries they fled from in very difficult circumstances. We find parallels between the situation today and that of 2003 and 2004. Once again, armed conflict in Darfur has resulted in the deaths of civilians, the looting and the destruction of homes and livelihoods, and the displacement of tens of thousands of persons within Darfur and across international borders. But there are also important differences. As noted, the current conflict has impacted Sudan as a whole. Fighting has convulsed the Sudanese capital of Khartoum and its cities of Omdurman and Bari, which previously had been spared from the many conflicts that have plagued Sudan since its independence. In Darfur, the violence has thus far centered on larger population centers, such as Zelingi, the capital of Central Darfur State, and El Geneina, the capital of West Darfur State, including displaced person camps in these cities. These are the circled areas on the map displayed on the screen, and I should have said that our opening is accompanied by a PowerPoint presentation.
And I'm assuming, Ms. von Wistinghausen, that it can be shown on the public monitors.
Absolutely so, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. While the fighting has not yet devastated villages and smaller towns in the manner of the 2003 to 2005 conflict, our clients living in IDP camps have reported to us that general insecurity prevails, they cannot leave their homes, and that food and water are scarce. Participating victim P5 was, as your honors are aware, scheduled to appear before you in person this week. Unfortunately, P5 and her children are unable to leave their dwelling in an IDP camp, let alone embark on the long journey to the seat of the court. When we spoke to her, she explained, and I quote, "The water is not available because of the security situation. Regarding food, the situation is very difficult. The prices are very high. Moving between the different localities is difficult, and there are no jobs available for people who work to earn money to buy food. There is no medicine in hospitals. The RSF and Janjaweed are currently controlling the area. Life is hard and expensive. Exit is very difficult. The living conditions are really very difficult. I have no hope." End of quote. Another participating victim, I will call him Ahmed, it's not his real name, a displaced person who was visiting the Bindisi area and was trapped there by the outbreak of fighting, told us the following during a phone call on the 5th of May. "Thank you for asking about us and caring about us. As to what you can do, of course, continuing doing the work you've already been doing in the Ali Kushaib case is important for us. I have one message to convey. The situation in Bindisi is very difficult, especially for pregnant women. The bad situation and living conditions would even worsen the situation of pregnant women and would increase the death toll amongst these women, particularly those of them who need special care to give birth. They need to travel outside Bindisi to seek medical care, but because of the security situation, they do not do it. I also was in the hospital and saw how bad the situation there is. There are a lot of issues and problems. We only pray that our situation gets better. End of quote. Our last direct contact with Ahmed was on 21st May. And despite regular attempts, we have unfortunately been unable to reach him for the last 2 weeks. And we've tried again last night. Participating victim P4 has lived at the same IDP camp with his family since 2004. He was also scheduled to appear before your honors. We have spoken to P4 several times since the outbreak of the current conflict, including this past Friday. He explained that it would be difficult and risky for him to leave the IDP camp to travel to the seat of the court. He said that there is, and I quote, too much insecurity in the border region, and that Janjaweed are roaming the area, and there are huge displacement movements in the region. Participating victims P4 and P5 both expressed the strong desire to appear before your honors when travel out of Darfur is safe again. On their behalf, and indeed on behalf of all the participating victims, we thank your honors for granting them the flexibility to appear before the trial chamber later in these proceedings, whether in person or through other means. The participating victims who live as refugees or resettled persons outside of Sudan, while physically safe, are now in constant anguish and worry over their loved ones who remain in Sudan. Dual status victim witness P0129, who lives in another country in Africa, informed us as follows in a recorded message, and I quote, "Our people, our relatives who are in Darfur and in Sudan, are suffering really since the war broke out between the army and Rapid Support Force. A lot of people are killed, and the RSF in the urban areas on motorcycles, on camels, and on horseback are robbing people of everything they have." End of quote. Dual status victim witness P0584, who lives outside of Africa, informed us, and I quote again, "I am going through a psychological crisis. It is too much for me. Whenever I get a call from Sudan, I expect bad news. I hope they," referring to his mother, father, and sisters, "will be safe." End of quote. Dual status victim witness P0585, who also lives outside of Africa, explained to us in a recorded message that, and I quote, "The reality is so harsh, specifically for our people in Wadi Sali, Garsila, Bindisi, Delej, Mukjar. The situation is very tough and catastrophic. In the area of Delej, Bindisi, Mukjar, the RSF has completely absolute control." End of quote. As we heard from witnesses during the prosecution's case, the major actors during the armed conflict in Darfur that commenced in 2003 were, on the one hand, the government of Sudan military and police forces, as well as government-funded and supported militias created from some of Darfur's ethnic Arab communities. Mr. Abd Al Rahman is alleged to have been a higher-level commander within these militias, which the local populations referred to as Janjaweed or Furzan. On the other side of the conflict were the Rebel Justice and Equality Movement and Sudan Liberation Movement, or ARMY, which drew their members from non-Arab Darfuri communities, primarily the Fur, Sagawa, and Masalit. Today's conflict in Sudan is between the government powers themselves, the government of Sudan Army, on one side, led by General Abd Al Rahman, and on the other, the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, led by General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, who is also known as Hemeti. Both of these individuals were allies of former President al-Bashir of Sudan, whom they overthrew to take power in 2019 in the midst of a popular uprising against the regime. As we heard from witnesses during the prosecution's case, the Janjaweed militias created during the 2003 to 2005 Darfur conflict were formalized by the government of Sudan over a number of years, culminating in the establishment of the RSF in 2013, with Mr. Hemeti at its head. I mention the current tragic events in Sudan not only because of this factual and historical connection with the Darfur conflict of 2003 to 2004, and the relevance of today's events to the participating victims and their families who are living them. I mention them also because today's conflict underlines in a stark fashion the fallacy of the long-standing debate over peace versus justice. As the interconnections between the past conflict in Darfur with the current situation demonstrate, the lack of accountability for alleged atrocities committed in the past is detrimental to lasting peace. In other words, lasting peace requires justice to be served. Short-term solutions, prioritizing the end of active hostilities at the cost of justice, may fail to deliver on the promise of long-term peace and stability, and thus fail to serve the interests of the people of Darfur. Many participating victims powerfully expressed the view that justice and accountability for the alleged crimes that are the subject of the current proceedings, while certainly a personal matter for them and their communities, are also central to the peaceful resolution of conflict in Darfur and a preventative measure against future crimes. The ICC has jurisdiction over the situation in Darfur from 1st of July 2002 and may consider steps that reach the affected communities of the past and current conflict, including the continuous gathering of evidence for further prosecutions when possible. Such measures would, we are convinced, reaffirm the commitment of the ICC to deliver on its mandate to prosecute potential perpetrators. As difficult as it may look for the moment, such steps may still contribute to deterrence in the ongoing conflict. Furthermore, and importantly, they may give those affected by the current conflict within Darfur, like our clients, hope that they are not overlooked and that accused perpetrators will be brought to justice. Dual status victim witness P0584 expressed before your honors that the court must, and I quote, achieve justice. That's what they have to do. You have to hold those criminals accountable so that such crimes are not repeated. End of quote. Dual status victim witness P0986 similarly addressed the trial chamber stating, and I quote, what I expect from this court, I expect that justice will be served and that the leaders of the regime will be prosecuted justly, and that this would lead to put an end to war and conflicts in Darfur. End of quote. I very well understand, Your Honours, that my role is limited to the representation of the participating victims in these proceedings, which concern Mr. Abd Al Rahman's charged responsibility for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity, primarily directed at the Fur population in West Darfur State, in the villages of Kudum and Bindizi in August 2003, and in and around the towns of Delej and Mugja from February to April 2004. However, for the reasons I have just addressed, it is impossible to speak about our clients and for your honors, the international community and the public to properly comprehend the circumstances without mentioning the current situation they are facing and its connection to the first Darfur conflict. It is unfortunately no exaggeration to state that these proceedings represent the only substantial and credible progress, whether in the domestic or international sphere, in the prosecution of persons alleged to be responsible for crimes committed during the 2003 to 2005 conflict. As highlighted in the report of the expert witness, Professor Alex de Waal, that first Darfur conflict resulted in estimated deaths directly as a result of fighting, as well as arising from hunger and disease, of at least 170,000 persons. Sexual violence against women and girls, which is reflected in the charged crimes arising from the events in Bindisi on 15 and 16 August 2003, was also a widespread feature of the first Darfur conflict, according to Professor de Waal's research. Arguably, the most long-standing and fundamental impact of the 2003 to 2005 conflict is that of the mass and long-term displacement of the civilian population following the destruction of their home villages, which is reflected in these proceedings in charges arising from the August 2003 attacks on Kudum and Bindisi, but also as relevant uncharged events preceding the alleged detention, torture, and execution of 4 civilian men in and around Mukjar and Delej in early 2004. Per the expert report, between April 2003 and January 2005, more than 2 million people in Darfur were forcibly displaced, with hundreds of thousands fleeing to Chad as refugees and the remainder seeking safety as internally displaced persons in camps across Darfur. Violence, destruction, and displacement targeting the people of Darfur, however, has never ceased, with tens of thousands more civilians having become IDPs, internally displaced persons, or refugees in the years leading up to the current outbreak of international conflict. The title of an October 2009 report of the African Union High-Level Panel on Darfur, admitted into evidence, poignantly captures this never-ending state of strife. It reads, and I quote, "Darfur, the quest for peace, justice, and reconciliation. It is a quest that remains sadly unfulfilled. While the current proceedings are rightly focused on the alleged acts and conduct of Mr. Abd Al Rahman in respect of the 31 confirmed counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, it is also appropriate for your honors, the court, and indeed the international community to take cognizance of the wider resonance and significance of these proceedings in light of the context I have just touched upon. It is certainly a dynamic that weighs on the minds of the participating victims. Dual status victim witness P0877, who testified before your honors 11 months ago, recorded and sent the following message to us in April, and I quote, "We hope that we'll meet up with you in good moments. I hope that the Sudan will enjoy the democratic rule. After outbreak of the current war in Khartoum, the situation here got worse. The movements of RSF and Janjaweed, the rising of the prices, we are succumbing into a completely lawless state. The prices of necessary consumer goods are already rising dramatically due to the fate of the poor citizen is catastrophic. The sad news, as you could have followed on the 26th of April 2023, is the release of the ICC indicted Darfur atrocities perpetrators, at the top of them Omar al-Bashir, Ahmed Haroun, and Abdul Rahim Hussein from Koba prison. We do not know where they are going to be. Will they flee from the country? Are they going to hide among their fellow military figures in the hospitals or in their home villages or towns? That is deplorable, and it has added more complexity to the situation. We pray to our Almighty Lord to help us for justice being done." End of quote. It is unknown when Mr. al-Bashir, against whom the pre-trial chamber of the ICC has issued arrest warrants for genocide and other alleged crimes in Darfur between 2003 and 2008, as well as Mr. Haroun and Mr. Hussein, whose ICC arrest warrants cover allegations during the period of 2003 to 2004, will appear before this court or any other judicial body. That is why the current proceedings, while limited in scope in the context of the court's jurisdiction over the Darfur situation, are an important and concrete testament to the international community's commitment to peace and justice. On behalf of the 600 participating victims and the larger Darfuri community, we very much hope, however, that this case does not remain the only instance of the process of justice taking its course, both for past and ongoing potential international crimes in Darfur. I turn now, Your Honours, to the present proceedings. The pre-trial chamber, in its confirmation of charges decision, found that there are substantial grounds to believe that between at least August 2003 and 2004, government of Sudan police and military forces, as well as militia commonly referred to as Janjaweed, carried out a widespread or systematic attack, primarily directed at the four civilian population of the Wadi Sali and Mukshar localities of West Darfur State. These attacks were conducted pursuant to a policy to target the four civilian population perceived as being associated with the LSA or JEM rebel movements. The pre-trial chamber also found that a non-international armed conflict was ongoing in Darfur, Sudan, at all relevant times from at least April 2003 until at least April 2004. As mentioned, the parties to the armed conflict were the government of Sudan forces and Janjaweed militia on one side, and the JEM and SLA rebel armed groups on the other side. The charges against Mr. Abd Al Rahman involve incidents in and around four locations: the neighboring villages of Kudum and Bindisi, and the town of Delej, in the Wadi Sali locality of West Darfur State, and the town of Mukshar, in the Mukshar locality of the same state. The widespread or systematic attacks against the primarily Fur population during this same period encompassed a much wider area, impacting tens of thousands of civilians, innocent men, women, and children. As Your Honours will recall, during the prosecution's case, witnesses gave evidence on devastating attacks conducted by government of Sudan forces and Janjaweed against villages in the Wadi Sali and Mukshar localities, such as Tendi, Waro, Fere, Taringa, Ordo, Arwala, Umdamena, Seder, Rangal, Korofota, Gaba, Burbur, Arada, Caskildo, Forgo, Abirla, Jartaga, Duguma Chargia, Dorgola, Dembo Kabadi, Kirka, Sindu, and Mindo, amongst others. As set out in our trial brief, many of the participating victims hailed from these other villages. Civilians were killed during these attacks or later died from injury or disease. Homes and property, including livestock and crops, were looted and destroyed, and the population displaced from their ancestral lands, the majority of whom have not been able to return to this day. The charge attacks on Kudum on 15th of August 2003 and Bindisi on 15th and 16th August 2003 squarely fall within the pattern of attacks that took place during this period. As prosecution witnesses testified, the attacks against these two villages took place as part of a single, continuous and devastating assault allegedly conducted by Janjaweed and government of Sudan forces against the primarily 4 civilian populations in the area between Mukjar and Bindisi, including villages such as Nierli, Tiro, Merli, and Seder. It is alleged that in Kodum, Bindisi, and their immediate surrounding areas, the Janjaweed and government of Sudan forces indiscriminately directed various acts of violence against the civilian population, inflicting death, injury, and destruction. Homes, property, and livestock were looted. The attacks systematically targeted the 4 community in a campaign to, and I quote, wipe out and sweep away, end of quote, driving the surviving 4 population out of their home villages. The attacking forces used racial slurs and derogatory and dehumanizing language against the 4 population during the attack. In Bindisi and its surroundings, and as we heard from both survivors and eyewitnesses during the prosecution's case, it is further alleged that 4 women and girls were the victims of sexual violence carried out in a brutal manner, oftentimes in the open and in the presence of other members of the community. The charged incidents in Mukjar and Delej between February and April 2004, while undeniably part of the widespread or systematic attack against the 4 civilian population, are also marked by certain differences in the nature of their facts and conduct in comparison to the armed attacks that took place in Kudum, Bindisi, and the many other primarily 4 villages in the Wadi Sali and Mukjar localities between August 2003 and April 2004. Between at least February and March 2004, Janjaweed and government of Sudan forces allegedly attacked several villages in the area surrounding Mukjar as part of the armed operation to attack rebel forces in and around the mountainous Sindhu area to the northeast, causing thousands of primarily 4 civilians to seek shelter in Mukjar. Many thousands of 4 civilians, including participating victims, were already sheltering in Mukjar in extremely difficult conditions, lacking proper food, water, and shelter, having fled the attacks against their villages that commenced in August 2003. In February 2004, Janjaweed and government of Sudan forces allegedly set up checkpoints around Mukjar and arrested hundreds of 4 males at these checkpoints, but also during house-to-house searches. It is alleged that many of the arrested were taken to Mukjar police station, where they were detained in inhumane conditions, interrogated, tortured, and verbally abused, before being transported out of Mukjar, beaten, insulted, and executed. Between at least August 2003 and March 2004, Janjaweed and government of Sudan forces allegedly attacked several villages in the areas surrounding Delej, resulting in the displacement of thousands of civilians from predominantly 4 villages to Delej, Garcilla, and other towns, where their living conditions were dire and they had to rely on aid provided by Delej residents and later humanitarian organizations. On or about Friday, 5th of March 2004, from the early morning, Janjaweed and government of Sudan forces allegedly surrounded Delej and prevented people from entering or leaving the town before going from house to house searching for 4 males who had been displaced to Delej from surrounding locations. Some prisoners were alleged to have been subsequently detained inside the Delej police station, where they were beaten and questioned. The Janjaweed and government of Sudan forces then allegedly brought between 100 and 200 arrested 4 males to an open area near the Delej police station, where they were made to lie in the hot sun, face down on the ground, and were denied food, water, and access to toilet facilities for prolonged periods of time, while being physically and verbally abused. The Janjaweed and government of Sudan forces proceeded to throw a number of 4 males onto the backs of vehicles, to be transported to different locations outside of Delege, where they were allegedly shot to death. This process is said to have been repeated several times on 5th March 2004.
Could Council slow down for the interpreters, please? Thank you.
Of dual status witness P. I was told. Okay. I apologize to the interpreters. I will slow down. Your Honours will recall the evidence of dual status witness P0877, who described what he experienced and witnessed while detained at the Mukhjar police station on the 2nd of March 2004, as he said, worst day of his life. This was notwithstanding having survived and fled from a devastating attack on his home village less than a week earlier, and subsequently becoming an IDP to this day. P0877 explained, and I quote, "Myself and my family, what we have experienced before 2 March was less severe because, yes, our money was taken, other people were killed, we had to escape to Mukhjar, we were seeking protection from the government. However, after that, the government and the Janjaweed started killing everybody, and we felt completely helpless. And that's why, until this moment, I remembered that day as the worst day ever in my life, and the life of the entire region." End of quote. This was from trial transcript 54, 54 pages 65 to 66. As highlighted in our trial brief, this fundamental sense of helplessness arising from the Mukhjar and Delege incidents was also connected to who from the Fo community is alleged to have been targeted during the charged incidents in Mukhjar and Delege, namely leaders such as Umdas and Sheikhs and other prominent persons. Witness 0720, who was subsequently granted the status of participating victim, explained to Your Honours, and I quote, "People lost their sense of security and their sense of confidence and trust. The people who are in charge and references for the people who have been are references for the people who have been imprisoned and killed. So what do you think will be the fate of normal people? So people felt extremely sad." End of quote. This was from trial transcript 43 at page 20. Your Honours have determined, based on a preliminary assessment, that 600 of the individuals who have thus far submitted applications to participate as victims in these proceedings have suffered harm as a result of the crimes allegedly committed in and around Kudum, Bindisi, Mukhtar and Delege. Under the court's jurisprudence, harm may be physical, like the effects of torture or sexual violence, or having to flee one's home. The harm may be psychological, meaning the mental impact of the crime on the direct victim as a result of harm to a close relation, or having witnessed crimes committed against other members of the community, or material harm, of course, like the destruction, loss, or theft of property. It needs to be said that the participating victims we consulted find it difficult to understand and to digest that, given the ICC's legal framework, the prosecutor's discretionary choices, and the pretrial chamber decision, the participation of victims are limited to the scope of the confirmed charges against the accused. This means that recognition by law determines which voices are heard or represented in the courtroom and which are not. This legal and perhaps also pragmatic selection of charges is nonetheless one that is a narrow view of victimhood and of the victim's realities, and therefore also of the truth of the ongoing sufferings of the much larger community of victims from the Darfur situation. Witness P0001, whom your honors will hear from tomorrow, is one such member of the larger community of victims of the first Darfur conflict. As I touched on at the beginning of this opening statement, the 600 individuals who have thus far been admitted to participate as victims in these proceedings are by no measure all of the persons, undoubtedly in the millions, who have suffered grievous harm from the commission of alleged crimes in Darfur over the last 2 decades and to this day, or even during the charged attacks on the villages of Koudoum and Bindisi and towns of Mukshar and Delej. However, given the legal framework of this court, only those persons who suffered harm arising from specific charges confirmed in this case can be recognized as participating victims. Moreover, given the current circumstances in Sudan, the victim application process, of course, faces many challenges. Your honors may appreciate that this reality causes understandable frustration and is, as we have addressed before, just a small glimpse of what has transpired in Darfur since July 2002, the commencement date of the Security Council's referral of the situation to the court. So it is on behalf of the 600 admitted participating victims that I am standing here before you. The purpose of the presentation of this victim's case is to give your honors, the parties, and indeed the public, the international community, an introduction to the lives of these 600 individuals before, during, and after the charged events. Even though every single victim has to be seen and considered and respected as an individual, their experiences are also representative of their Darfuri family and friends who were victims of the same or similar crimes committed against the Darfur population during this period. 56 witnesses appeared before the trial chamber to give evidence during the course of the prosecution case, with an additional 25 witnesses providing testimony by way of written and signed statements. Of the witnesses who appeared before the chamber, 6 were so-called dual status witnesses, meaning that at the time of their testimony, they had the status of both prosecution witnesses and victims. An additional 20 prosecution witnesses, after the conclusion of their testimonies, applied to be and were admitted by your honors as participating victims. Of the witnesses whose prior recorded testimony was admitted under Rule 68(2)(b) or C of the Rules of Procedure and Evidence, 3 have also the status of participating victims. Their testimonies brought to life, and I quote, harrowing accounts, as stated by Prosecutor Karim Khan during his statement to United Nations Security Council on the situation in Darfur on the 26th of January of this year. I can only echo the prosecutor's words when he said that he commended, and I quote, the heroism, the perseverance, the dedication of the survivors, end of quote. And he continued to say, their courage and their perseverance, really against all odds, was something that he found truly humbling. End of quote. On that point, I cannot agree more. In our view, the presentation of the case of the participating victims should be a vehicle, as much as possible, for Your Honours to hear from these brave survivors themselves, to listen to their own words and stories, with minimum filtering by us, and to put those in the context of the events in Darfur in 2003 and 2004, the crimes allegedly committed by the accused, the past 20 years that elapsed since then, and their lives today. The participating victims are best placed to speak about their lives, their losses, their wishes, and indeed their hopes. They are best placed to explain their rights before the conflict and how and why they want those back. Almost all the victims are very remote from this court, not only physically, but still, they are the ones best placed to explain what they mean when they ask for justice and what they expect from this trial, as from the trial chamber in particular. It lies in the nature of the 2003 to 2005 conflict, the current situation of the participating victims in Darfur, most of whom live as displaced persons, and all those living in refugee camps in other countries and in the wider diaspora, that communication and consultation with the victims is a difficult, challenging, and sometimes unsatisfying undertaking for the legal representative of victims. However, we have endeavored to collect as many views and concerns of participating victims as possible through consultations and obtaining written and audio-video recorded communications, to have those reflected in our trial brief, but also during the upcoming few days in this courtroom that are dedicated to the participating victims. It is well understood that every effort can again only be a small glimpse of the physical and mental reality of each and every individual who I represent, and can sometimes not be more than a truly well-intentioned interpretation from our side. And I hand over to my Associate Counsel, Mr. Shah.
Good morning, Your Honors. It is vitally important, in our view, for Your Honors to understand who the participating victims were in 2003 and 2004, and who they are today in 2023. It is worth briefly reminding ourselves of the history and culture of the Fur people of Darfur. Expert witness Professor DeWall, during his testimony, characterized the core features of historic Fur society as follows, and I quote, "The Fur, what these groups have in common, is the Fur language, a tradition of affection for the set of values associated with the historic Sultanate of Darfur, a very strong attachment to the land, feeling that their identity is very closely tied in with their control over the land. It doesn't mean that they wanted to exclude others from the land. They have a long tradition of welcoming strangers who they would allow to settle, and those strangers would, over the generations, become part of the community and become Fur. And of course, also welcoming nomads. So it is a set of values, along with culture, language, and affinity to a historical past." End of quote. As the majority of Fur people certainly in the Wadi Salah and Mukjar localities, are now displaced in their own country and to neighboring countries and in the wider diaspora. Much of these traditions and practices have been immeasurably impacted. In a video call with participating victims on 13 March 2023, one victim said to us, "Life now is tough and the opposite of what it was. Before the war, we lived a normal life. We worked in farming. We had cattle. Our children went to school, and we celebrated ceremonies with our neighbors. But now, life has become very difficult. We are refugees and lost all of that. Our traditions have been thrown away." End of quote. Witness P0643, during his testimony before your honors, provided perspective on how the conflict and its aftermath have influenced the younger four generations' perception of this welcoming tradition. He stated, and I quote, "The Fur by nature are peaceful, and they are the countrymen, the people of Darfur, although all the people there are the inhabitants of Darfur. The Fur are known to be the main inhabitants, that Darfur is their own land, and these are good people. They are welcoming people, and they can welcome any guest that would come to their land. That is how they were, good-natured, back then. But today, of course, we don't have the same nature, good nature. We don't have the same qualifications. The young generation does not have the same qualifications as their parents when it comes to welcoming others or accepting the others, because they believe that this was a very big mistake by their elders to welcome everybody else, because at the end, they sustained damages by the people that they had welcomed. So the new generation is totally different from the old generation. And that's at trial transcript 57, pages 59 to 60. Now, regarding farming and livelihood, which we heard a lot about during the testimony of prosecution witnesses, one witness who was later admitted as a participating victim described the general situation in the villages between and surrounding Bindizi and Mukjar as follows, and I quote, "Prior to the attacks, these villages were safe and were productive. They were providing all nearby towns with crops and livestock. They were stable, they were filled with people, and they were prosperous. Life was prosperous. After the events, it became nothing but rubble. All that was left was trees and so forth, but there was no life there. Everything got destroyed." And that's at transcript 45 at page 33. Farming, as well as caring for animals and livestock, was a family affair, with men, women, and older children involved in this daily work. Animals were also important in the daily lives of the Fur communities of Wadi Salah and Mukjar localities. In answer to a question from the common legal representative, dual status victim witness P0907 explained, and I quote, "Livestock was very important for us because we mainly relied on livestock and farming for our livelihood. We used donkeys for farming activities. We relied on the daily products of our cattle, also to feed our children. And when we needed money, we sold one of our animals in order to get money in return." And that is at transcript 95 at page 5. The testimony of the prosecution's witnesses and the applications of the participating victims are replete with recollections that an almost uniform feature of the attacks on their home villages in 2003 and 2004 was the pillaging and taking of that livestock, which represented significant amounts of family and community wealth and resources for the Fur people. The pursuit of education was also an important touchstone in the Fur community, including being able to pay for school fees, uniforms, and supplies. And this was very much evident in the testimony of the prosecution's witnesses. One witness described the current situation of persons from the Fur community who were displaced by the conflict, saying, and I quote, "Until now, after 18 long years, people are still impacted by what happened. We still have children beggars, their fathers and their mothers were killed, and they can't go to schools. They have no money to pay fees, and they don't have any school uniforms or school books." And that's at transcript 54 at page 70. The witness and the participating victim who will address the trial chamber in person will speak more to this particular issue. Another important feature of the Fur community were their communal and traditional leadership structures. Community leadership at the local level was organized in primarily three hierarchies: sheikhs at the level of the village, followed by umdas, who would be responsible for several villages, and then shartais as a regional community authority. Community leaders were, generally speaking, respected figures and central nodes of guidance, information dissemination, organization, dispute resolution, and decision-making, including in times of crisis for the Fur people. Dual status victim witness P0877 related during his testimony before your honors, and I quote, "In our community, the community leaders, starting with Shartai, and after that, at the lower levels, umdas and sheikhs, they assumed a social role to resolve disputes, intertribes or intra-tribes. They were determining weekly the family disputes. They would order people to do some action, like if there were collective actions such as building houses. They were also participating in religious matters and social matters. And that is at transcript 54 from pages 59 to 60. The importance of community leaders in the fabric and functioning of Fur society, including the stability and sense of safety they provided, crystallizes in the testimonies of witnesses who discuss the impact of the targeting of community leaders during the conflict, including in respect of the charge incidents in and around Delej and Mukjar in early 2004. For example, dual status victim witness P0907 described the cascading effects arising from the killing of Fur community leaders. And I quote, "The impact was intense because they were the community leaders, our community leaders. They would manage our affairs and take care of us in a very well manner. So their loss impacted the community because it's like a domino effect. Once it starts, everything is affected. When this domino effect starts, if things get scattered and chaotic, if you have a leader, for example, a communal leader, one of the notables, they would be able to address the authorities, government authorities, to fund schools, hospitals. So say when this notable person dies, the whole society suffers because we don't have someone to take care of us." And that is at transcript 95, pages 10 to 11. One witness testified to an additional dimension of harm arising from the targeting of Fur community leaders. He noted, and I quote, these were people who headed very big families. In our community, the Umda usually has more than one wife and would have many sons and daughters. So the impact was very significant for the sons and daughters of the victims in the first place, before talking about the impact on the community. And that is at transcript 57 from pages 58 to 59. Lastly, but also importantly, we would also like to give your honors an idea of what a Fort Village looked like in 2003 and 2004 and how the houses are built, which also helps to explain, as we heard in the testimony of the prosecution's witnesses, how easy it was for these structures to be completely destroyed by fire and other means. Now, witness P1, whom you will hear from tomorrow, will be able to address the particular images you see on your screen right now, which we also included in our trial brief. In the fur villages of Wadi Salah and Mukjar localities at the time of the outbreak of the conflict, most houses were built from grasses and leaves, wood, and earthen materials. Additionally, a house often referred to a single-room structure. So a family might have more than one house, perhaps clustered within a compound. And, Your Honors, I will now, with your leave, turn the floor back over to my colleague, Ms. von Bistinghausen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw.
Yes, Your Honors, I would like to turn now to some statistics. I know that we say iudex non calculat, but sometimes numbers give a better idea. And we would like you to have a concrete idea of who the participating victims are if we focus for a moment on their genders and ages and the localities they come from. Because when I speak about victims, it is not a reference to some kind of abstraction, the victims, which is based on the idea of victimhood, whatever that means. To the contrary, I want to stress again, and we will keep doing that, the individuality of every single person I'm representing. Among the 600 participating victims, 220 are women and 380 are men, which leads us to a percentage of more or less 34 to 63, 64. It's also worth noting that in respect to the charged crimes in and around Mukjar and Delej, direct victims are predominantly male, although women are at the very least indirect victims of these events. As one victim said to us, and I quote, "I became a widow and my children became orphans." End of quote. Certainly, statistics cannot adequately reflect the story and suffering of each individual. One of the aspects most difficult to reflect in numbers is the very specific harm women have suffered through gender-based and sexual violence. In fact, I believe nothing but the words of those affected that I don't want and I cannot filter can represent what they lived. I will therefore share with your honors excerpts of their accounts in their victims' applications regarding these events. During the attack on Brindisi, which is the only charged incident in which such crimes have been alleged in these proceedings, 8 female victims reported being raped, in some cases multiple times. One of them, who I will call Khadija, which is not her real name, recounted, and I quote, "Our hearts had almost stopped. They were repeating, 'Catch the beautiful women.' The Janjaweed militias raped me, as they did to a lot of other women. They also raped my niece, who was still a teenager, and killed her." End of quote. Neither can the numbers fully reflect the suffering of pregnant women and those caring for infants. One victim, who I'll refer to as Aisha, shared her difficulties finding shelter with her infant, who was only 14 days old. Rejected by other people hiding in the forest due to the crying infant, she reports having been discovered by Janjaweed men and raped by more than 5. Another victim, I will call him Khaled, speaks about his wife when he recounts, and I quote, "When I returned to the village, I found that my wife was badly injured in her tummy. Her son, who was only 3 years old, and whom she was carrying on her back, was also injured in his leg. I tried helping them, but I couldn't. She was 9 months pregnant and was dying. We stayed in the forest for 2 days, and when I went back to the village, I found her dead." End of quote. And unfortunately, I could go on giving such examples. But I have chosen not to quote even worse accounts in public. Your Honours will, of course, recall the harrowing evidence of witnesses P0011, P1073, and P1074, all of whom were subsequently admitted as participating victims. They courageously appeared before your Honours to describe what they suffered at the hands of the attackers during the assault on Bindisi, and the physical and psychological consequences of rape that continues to impact them almost 2 decades later. The consequences of sexual and gender-based violence against 4 women is part of what will be addressed by P001 when she appears before your Honours tomorrow, because she knows, she senses it every day in the IDP camp in Chad, where she has lived now for 20 years and made her observations. Let's now turn our attention to children, too often overlooked in armed conflicts. The approximate age range of the participating victims today is from 19 to 94 years, with an average of 45 years. At the time of the charged crimes, their ages ranged from 4 months to 74 years, with an average of 28.5 years. However, I would like to draw your attention to the experience of this particularly vulnerable group. It is of note that around 20% of the participating victims were children under the age of 18 at the time of the events. 123 children from Mukjar, Delej, Kodum, and Bindisi are participating victims in these proceedings, and we know that this number is far from reflecting the actual number of underage victims. Some of them, like Mr. Hassan Hassan, participating victim P0002, who will speak to your honors later today, in public, were younger than 10 years old. And Mr. Hassan will explain in detail what that meant and means until today. Another of those many children, originally from Bindisi, and who I will call Adam, said in his victim application, and I quote, "My mother was killed inside our home. I was terrorized, saddened, and forced to leave my home region and live in camps for displaced people. I left my home region and all my childhood memories behind." End of quote. Another child victim of the Bindisi attack, whom I will refer to as Fatima, writes, and I quote, "I was terrorized and extremely saddened by having to leave my homeland and leaving all my memories behind me." End of quote. We must also not forget the many parents who lost a child during the charge incidents or during their displacement. A participating victim, who I will call Mariam, an indirect victim of the Delege incident, says what probably many of those parents feel, and I quote, "Since the day my son was killed, and up to this day, I sometimes don't know which day of the week I'm in. Besides, I've been left alone, without offspring or guardian." End of quote. Moreover, the attacks against the Fo community were widespread. Almost all of the participating victims are originally from towns or villages in the Wadi Sali and Mokjar localities. To date, 81 different towns and villages were identified as places of origin. A majority of the victims are from the villages of Kudum or Bendisi, or the towns of Delege or Mukjar. For 21 individuals, their place of origin remains unclear at this stage. The vast majority of the participating victims now reside in internally displaced persons camps in Darfur and in refugee camps in Chad. A smaller number of participating victims live in other towns and cities in Darfur or elsewhere in Sudan, including Khartoum. The remainder of the participating victims live in different parts of the world, mostly as refugees, including Egypt, Ghana, Canada, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Sweden, France, and Israel. Our proposal, accepted by your honors, to hear during the presentation of our case from victims currently living in Darfur, in Chad, and the wider diaspora, to give evidence or present views and concerns, is based on several factors, including the nature and content of the crime-based evidence presented during the prosecution's case, the particularities of the crimes charged arising from the four incidents that are the subject of this case, the passage of time since the charged events have taken place, the current and past locations and living circumstances of the participating victims in the 5 Sudanese states now comprising the Darfur region, Chad, and the wider diaspora, and the very personal, but we think also representative nature of the evidence of views and concerns the individual is expected to provide. In respect of life and living conditions in the refugee camps in eastern Chad and the long-term impact on those who have now nearly spent 20 years there, were even born there, witness P001 and participating victim P003 will speak to you from their own experience, and they are best placed to speak for themselves and their peers and to express themselves freely and as publicly as possible in this forum. As regards what it means to have to move away from your home country to another continent, to claim asylum there, and how this impacts the individual and the family in the long term, participating victim P002 will address you later this afternoon. Regarding victims still living in Darfur, our goal has been frustrated by the current armed conflict in Sudan. I have addressed at the beginning of this opening that very unfortunately, but understandably, and also sadly, two of the participating victims who had accepted to travel a long way to be here in person from Darfur to share their views and concerns with your honors, P004 and 005, are now confined to their homes in IDP camps, reliving exactly the same fears as nearly 2 decades ago, unable to move and in a dire situation. However, we're not giving up the hope that the situation in Sudan will improve in the near term, even though it doesn't look good, and that we will be able to bring them both to speak here with your honors in person, an important moment that they have long, long been waiting for. While I have, in the course of this opening, touched on aspects of harm for the participating victims, their families, and the larger Darfur community arising from the charged incidents, I would like to highlight now for your honors and the public in a more structured fashion how these events have impacted the lives and futures of our clients. Our brief, of course, also addresses harm to the participating victims in a more expansive manner. Harm can be distinguished between, on the one hand, the participating victims who were detained and subjected to mistreatment and or attempted murder, and on the other, the victims who sustained psychological harm, either because they witnessed atrocities committed against members of their community, or because they have a family relationship with one or more of the directly impacted persons. In Mukjar, a large number of arrested males were allegedly taken to the police station, where they were detained in inhumane conditions and tortured. In Delej, it is also alleged that between 100 and 200 arrested 4 males were similarly detained in an open area near the police station and also subjected to mistreatment. The physical harm sustained by participating victims in this context ranges from minor injuries to extensive and irreversible bodily harm, the result of severe cruelty and inhumanity. In Mukjar, in addition to being kept in cramped cells with no access to toilets and in stiflingly hot temperatures, participating victims were beaten, whipped, tortured, mutilated, and shot at. A number of participating victims describe having been tortured with a hot iron or with a plastic container that was set on fire and melted on their backs. One participating victim, I will call him Ahmed, states in his victim application, and I quote, "The cell was packed, dark and hot. There was no room to move and no toilet. I was beaten on the head with a stick and burned on the leg with an iron." End of quote. Another participating victim, and I will call him Abdullah, describes how soldiers opened fire on his left foot, causing him to lose the second toe, next to his big toe. The description of physical harm suffered by victim in the Delej incident is no less horrific. One participating victim, I will refer to him as Yusuf, describes how he was severely beaten and tortured, and that one of the Janjaweed put a finger in his right eye. As a result, he lost sight in that eye, and which still causes him pain today. In respect of both the Mukjar and Delej charged incidents, the long-term physical impact is widespread among the direct victims of these crimes and include serious mobility impairments, mutilations, back and neck injuries, and persistent pain, bullet injuries and scars, and other injuries and scars from beatings and whipping. The psychological harm related to the mistreatment and abuse suffered is no less omnipresent among the harm described by the participating victims. They generally all suffer to this day from distress, anxiety, depression, as well as sleeping and eating disorders. Most of them never received any relevant counseling or psychological support. We must not overlook the indirect victims of these incidents, as well as the members of the full community who directly witnessed some of these alleged crimes. Many victims, such as dual status witnesses like P0720, P0994, and P0955, sustained psychological harm because they directly witnessed atrocities committed against members of their community, or because they have a family relationship with one or more of the detained persons. One dual status witness explained, and I quote, "To this day, I have psychological trouble, difficulty eating, anxiety and stress because of what I have witnessed. I lost my friends and acquaintances, and I think about them very often." End of quote. Material harm was suffered by almost all of the participating victims from the Kudum and Bindisi charged events. Suleiman, again not his real name, states in his victim application that he lost everything he owned during the 15th of August 2003 attack on Kudum. His home was burned down and all the livestock, cows, sheep, camels, donkeys, the contents of his house, his agricultural material and products, seeds and crops were looted. This account was one we heard from many dual status victims, like P0012, who recounted, and I quote, "In Kudum, they took all of the livestock, cows, sheep, camels, donkeys, and house contents. They also took our agricultural material and products, and the seeds and crops we had. I had to flee the farm without harvesting the crops that were ready. My house was burned down." End of quote. Your Honor, I note the time. I think I would need something like 15 to 20 minutes to finish. And I apologize for not having been very good in anticipating how long it takes.
No, that's fine. I think in that case, if it's another 15, 20 minutes, we'll break now and pick it up at 2:30. Thank you.
Very well, thank you.
Rise, veuillez vous lever.